5 subconscious habits that build momentum. There's a kind of person who, on the surface, looks like they are doing very little. They are not grinding. They are not posting about discipline at 5 in the morning. They are not white-knuckling their way through a to-do list. And yet, somehow, months pass and they have quietly built something real. A project that actually finished. A habit that actually stuck. A life that somehow has more shape than it did before. And when you ask them how they did it, they almost always say some version of the same thing. I don't really know. I just kept going. Most people hear that and assume it's false modesty, but it isn't, because what those people are describing is not a conscious strategy. It is something operating several layers beneath awareness, something that does not have a name yet in most conversations about productivity or self-improvement. And because it doesn't have a name, most people either dismiss it or completely miss it in themselves. What we are actually talking about is momentum, and not the motivational poster version of it, not the feeling of being on fire, not the rush of a good streak. Momentum, in the psychological sense, is something quieter and stranger than that. It is the gradual reduction of internal resistance. It is the way certain small, almost invisible behaviors slowly rewire how effortful action feels to the nervous system. There are 5 of them that appear consistently across behavioral research and human experience, and the unusual thing is that none of them look like discipline from the outside. They look more like personality quirks, like small preferences, like nothing in particular. The first is what psychologists sometimes call environmental design, though most people experience it simply as tidying up the path. When someone clears their workspace before they end the day or sets out their running shoes the night before, what they are actually doing is reducing what researchers call activation energy, the mental cost of beginning. A 2010 study from Duke University found that roughly 40% of human behavior is habitual, not chosen. What this means is that the environment is constantly making decisions before the conscious mind even arrives. The people who quietly build momentum are almost always people who have learned, often without realizing it, to shape their environments so that starting becomes the easiest option. The second habit is harder to see because it looks like inconsistency. It is the practice of doing less than you could on a given day, stopping before the tank is empty. A musician who ends the session while they still have ideas left. A writer who stops mid-paragraph on purpose. What this does neurologically is preserve a sense of unfinished business, which the brain finds deeply uncomfortable. The Zygarnik effect, named after a Soviet psychologist who noticed in the 1920s that waiters remembered unpaid orders far better than completed ones, suggests the brain stays cognitively attached to uncompleted tasks. Stopping before completion is not laziness. It is a quiet strategy for ensuring the brain stays pulled toward the work between sessions. The third habit is what might be called identity anchoring, not in a self-help sense, but in a behavioral one. When someone consistently describes themselves, even in private internal monologue, as someone who does a certain thing, rather than someone who is trying to do that thing, the behavioral research suggests the action becomes less effortful over time. James Clear's synthesis of identity-based habit research explains this as the difference between outcome goals and identity goals. The person chasing an outcome is always negotiating with themselves. The person who has quietly absorbed an identity is not. The fourth is something most people have never considered intentional at all. It is the habit of protecting low-stakes wins. Not big victories, small, almost embarrassing completions. The email sent, the one paragraph written, the single set of push-ups done when the full workout wasn't possible. The brain processes completion as reward. Dopamine is released not at the achievement, but at the moment of resolution. People who consistently give themselves small completions, rather than all-or-nothing attempts, are essentially training the brain to associate effort with satisfaction, rather than effort with failure. Over time, this changes how effortful action feels to the body. The fifth habit is the most counterintuitive of all. It is the practice of not tracking everything. There is strong evidence that external monitoring, Charts, streaks, public accountability systems actually shifts the motivational source from internal to external. Once that shift happens, the behavior becomes dependent on the system rather than on any internal orientation. The people who build the most durable momentum tend to hold their progress loosely. They notice it without measuring it obsessively. They are building something, but they are not constantly checking its temperature. None of this is to say these habits are better than other approaches. Some people are wired, by temperament or by necessity, for intense effort followed by recovery. Some nervous systems need high stakes to activate. Neither orientation is more virtuous than the other. The brain is not a moral instrument, it is an adaptive one. But what is worth sitting with is this: the version of momentum that lasts tends to be invisible from the outside. It does not announce itself. It does not require performance. It accumulates the way interest accumulates, quietly, in the background, almost without permission. If you have ever looked at your life and felt like you were doing something right without being able to articulate what it was, this might be the closest explanation for why. You were not being lucky. You were not working some secret system. Your nervous system had found, through trial and experience, a few quiet grooves that made forward motion easier than stillness. That is not nothing. That is actually most of it. If this felt like something you recognized rather than something you learned, there is probably more going on beneath the surface than you have been given language for. The next layer tends to be even more interesting.